In the previous lesson, we introduced the period of the Gilded Age. We looked at the political divisions that existed. We looked at the political corruption that existed at all levels of government, not just the period or at least the level of the federal government, but also focusing on state and local governments as well. We examined too the fact that the Gilded Age was a period that was highlighted by the era of weak presidents. We have people like Grover Cleveland. We have people like Ulysses S. Grant, for example, Rutherford Hayes. All of these individuals being members of this sort of weak group of presidents. This lesson is going to talk about how the Gilded Age impacted the social divisions within the US state during this period. We will talk about the implication of new technologies that was had on the American state, as well as the position that was had on African Americans, because of course the idea of understanding US history without reference to the racial divisions that have always plagued the state is obviously incredibly naive. So this is an examination of social, regional, and ethnic divisions, essentially within the period of the Gilded Age itself. And we can think about regional divisions straight away by looking at the divisions that were still had between the North and South. Of course, don't forget the echoes of the American Civil War was still very much in swing during the period of the Gilded Age. Some may argue that the Civil War is still an issue that is debated to this very day in the United States, and those people would be potentially quite correct. So to say that there were no divisions between North and South during the Gilded Age would be an incredibly silly thing to think. The North became increasingly industrial while the South remained relatively urban. So this is ultimately a major problem. Because, of course, with the rise of industrialization, with the bringing of industrialization from Britain into the Americas, we have the problem that industrialization brings with it economic prosperity. And it led to a situation where the development of wealth in the North versus the South became incredibly unequal, and this inequality would obviously further tensions and divisions between these two areas. The North became resented by everyone, by many elsewhere, as dominating the shape of US political and economic development, because the North increasingly was becoming industrial and increasingly contributing to the prosperity of the US's economy. And because the North is where a lot of the federal government sits, we see that the US's political system becomes dominated by those who had the best interest of the North in mind rather than that of the South. It was also felt politically that the views of the North were better represented by the federal government. This is obviously problematic for an increasingly lagging behind South that is, of course, not going to be able to keep up in any meaningful sense with the North in terms of the economy. We saw this during the Civil War itself, in fact, and also one that were becoming increasingly alienated from the perspective of politics, divided entirely over the issue of slavery and the representation of African Americans within society. We can then throw into the mix the idea of new technologies and the influence that new technologies have over the divisions in both society, region, and ethnic and ethnicities, should I say. So after the era of Reconstruction, we make mention of this idea of a new South, something which saw the modernizing of the South as a positive idea, and embracing new technologies, embracing potentially industrialization, and embracing the bringing in of the South back to the fold of the United States more fully. Now we see, for example, the New South embraces a number of these ideas, such as the creation of railroads as the result of modernization and new technologies. New industries like coal mining would grow in places like West Virginia, and we also see the new steel industry becoming more prominent in places like Alabama. All of these obviously very southern parts of the country. The entrepreneur James Buchanan would revolutionize the tobacco industry with the use of modern machinery. In a similar way that Gutenberg modernizes printing with his printing press hundreds and hundreds of years before, Buchanan would modernize the tobacco industry with the automation of the creation of new cigarettes and all these different kinds of products as a result of the use of new machinery. Machines like these were able to produce around 100,000 cigarettes a day, which of course made any kind of competition without these use of machines were essentially impossible. But despite all of these developments, despite all of these new modernization techniques, these new technologies, this idea of a new South that was beginning to take shape and to take hold following the Civil War, most of the South did remain incredibly rural and focused heavily on agriculture rather than actually embracing any of these new ideas. So in addition to the North and South divide that we see, that is clearly evident and has been clearly evident for almost the entirety of the history of the United States, especially during the period of the Civil War, there is also a growing East and West divide as well. Don't forget, the United States is an incredibly large country, and it is an incredibly culturally diverse country as well. The idea of a Democrat, for example, on the East Coast is completely different to the idea of a Democrat on the West Coast. This is one of the things that makes the US political system so fascinating to explore, because there isn't this harmonizing and almost hegemony of ideas, because it is so divided, as owing to how large it is and how different each of these cultures are. Development west has always been a major feature of US history, as well as the idea of US culture. This idea of manifest destiny and the idea of pushing the frontier all the way across the West into places like California became an incredibly popular idea. In the final quarter of the 1800s, for example, around 33% of the population of California and Nevada were still foreign born. They were still not actually native to that particular region. So with pushing west across the frontier, many in the West resented the federal government, which was obviously mainly situated in the east. Washington, D.C. is situated very much in the east of the United States. They valued what they believed as this idea of rugged individualism. And following the Civil War, the development of the cattle industry had led to huge ranches which would feed the growing populations of eastern cities, which would further instantiate this division and resentment of the federal government, which was mainly seen as an Eastern issue, an Eastern invasion, if you will, an Eastern push into the way of life of the West, but also the fact that these huge ranchers would actually be contributing to the development of the East, and it was seen that they were taking away things that was going on in the West. Most people moved west to farm mainly because of the 1862 Homeland Act. This act essentially allowed 160 acres free to those who could farm it for 5 years. So this idea of moving west, of manifest destiny, of growing the frontier, of going to these areas and farming and having so much of this land yourself was considered to be part of the American dream of the time. Now, the American dream will continue and develop and shape depending on what period of history we're talking about. But at least during the 1860s, the idea of the American dream was the idea of owning such a large plot of land that you can farm and that you can grow yourself. And part of the motivation and part of the impetus of this was, of course, the 1862 Homeland Act. Farmers in the South and the West faced huge problems when it came to indebtedness and debts, because markets were so unstable. If the market collapses, this would cause more issues for farmers. Problems that, of course, caused further resentment of the East. So those in the South didn't particularly like the North, and those in the West didn't particularly like the East. That's essentially how this divide really formulates. And given the fact that the federal government is sort of situated northeast, it means that they basically get the brunt of all of the hatred and resentment. Given the fact that the South don't like the North and the West don't like the East, the northeastern federal government probably isn't going to be the most popular of institutions. Let me finish by talking about the position of African Americans. Of course, the position of African Americans is going to be incredibly important, even up to the present day, and we won't be getting to the present day in this series, but we will get up to the 1980s. And of course, the position of African Americans from the 1860s to the 1980s is incredibly important. It develops and changes in a multitude of different ways, which we will get to, and we'll come back to multiple times throughout this series. Now, we know already that because of the fact that America was, at least, and some argue still is to this day, a deeply racist state, African Americans would face discrimination throughout the country itself. Of course, southern states increasingly passed into law the systemic oppression of African Americans, so they could no longer rely on the fact that African Americans were considered to be slaves. They could no longer rely on the practice of imprisoning African Americans following the passage of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, I should just make it very clear, the 13th Amendment essentially makes it unconstitutional for slaves to exist, the abolition of slavery and the abolition of servitude. However, there is a major condition on that essentially the forced labor and the servitude of an individual can be justified on the basis of their position as prisoners. So, of course, many of the southern states, immediately following the passage of the 13th Amendment, just imprisoned the black population and had essentially a de facto slave state. This would continue for a very, very, very long time in different parts of the country. I believe even to an extent it came up to the 1940s and the 1950s that this would continue. But in addition to this, we see the fact that there was increasingly laws that were passed that were systemically biased and systemically enforced racial discrimination against African Americans. These were known as Jim Crow laws, and these Jim Crow laws were implemented in order to ensure that there would be a segregation between whites and blacks. The idea being that black people would have to use their own toilets, they would have to use their own restaurants, they'd have to use their own water fountains. It's a very famous image of a black and a white water fountain that would be in force. We also have the implementation of voter suppression. This is done by the idea of literacy tests and quote-unquote grandfather clauses. It is no longer the case that you can discriminate on the basis of race, or at least openly discriminate on the basis of race and suppress voters on the basis of race. So instead they just went round it and led to de facto discrimination. So essentially what grandfather clauses did was stipulate that only those whose grandfathers were able to vote could vote. Now, because the vast majority of African Americans' grandfathers were slaves and were therefore unable to vote, it essentially removed every single African American in southern states from the voting pool and suppressed their ability to vote. Literacy tests did the exact same thing because they knew that formerly freed slaves were unable to read and write. It meant that they were unable to vote. And so rather than directly saying we are going to suppress the African American vote, they basically did that, but did it in a roundabout way that achieved the same results. That's why I say it was a de facto discrimination rather than de jure discrimination. Terror and intimidation would also be rife during this period. We have the growing number of what became known as lynchings during this time, which was essentially the execution, the torture and execution of black individuals, often done in very public settings. We will get to this in more detail when we continue to focus on the growth of Jim Crow legislation, the imposition of segregation, and then the pushback against segregation following the end of the Second World War with the 50s and 60s with the Civil Rights Act. To avoid these issues, many African Americans decided that they just wanted to move north, and this became known as the Great Migration. Now, this is problematic because Southern whites, while hating African Americans because they were all very deeply racist, a lot of them still are to this day, they still wanted the labor supply that the African American community actually provided for them. So they wanted them to leave, and they hated them, but they also needed them at the same time. I'm sure that was a very interesting psychological contradiction that existed within their minds. And so because of the fact that in the North, even though there was of course discrimination in the North in the US, it was nowhere near to the same extent as in the South. There was less discrimination essentially. Many African Americans moved north and just simply wanted to have a better life there, which you obviously can't blame them for. And obviously the South would then complain because that would be a reduction in the labor supply. So the position of African Americans at this period was obviously better than the period of slavery, but not much better. Let's just make that very, very clear. It wasn't by much that there was a more a more positive situation. In the next lesson, we'll start to look at the economic conditions that takes place during the Gilded Age, the growth of monopolies, the growth of corruption, and we'll talk about what the implications of this were and the backlash that was had when we see the implementation of antitrust legislation to try and break up these large monopolies.